Hello, ladies and gentlemen, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and today I'm going to be returning to Commander the Great War. What is this? I think part 22 of this series. This is by far the longest series that I've had running. Before that, I think it was Buzz Aldrin's Space Program Manager. Prior to this, most Let's Play series that I had started or gotten involved with, I'll be honest, I kind of burnt out after a pretty short period of time here, but this game I've enjoyed quite a bit. It was on my top 5 most played list of 2014. Even though the game didn't come out in 2014, it was one of my favorite games that I played during that year, and that's continuing into early 2015 as well. It's been a game that I've got a lot of enjoyment out of, and while the Let's Play's definitely taken longer than I would have liked to get finished, I've certainly enjoyed the time I've spent with it. And if you've been following my channel, you may have thought, hey, he's doing some Total War stuff now. Maybe he'll forget about this game and kind of end the Let's Play like he's done a few other series. Well, if you thought that, you'd be wrong. Obviously, as I've returned to this series, I have every intention of finishing this series out, regardless of whether it's a Central Powers victory or defeat. We will fight it out. Now, as you can see here on the Western Front, we've got a French unit cut off and surrounded here in the winter. They had advanced and taken Strasbourg, but the French didn't move in troops behind it quick enough to reinforce it, so we were able to move troops in behind them and cut them off. Basically a offensive which obtained many of its objectives, but was launched without sufficient support from other Allied units or without enough Allied reserves, so now they are in danger of defeat. Meanwhile, in Italy, well, the situation is complex. There are quite a few enemy units and quite a few enemy air units in the vicinity, but at the same time, we have been able to obtain quite a few successes. In the Balkans, Romania's capital is surrounded, but because of the game rules, which I know I've harped on almost every single video, the game rules allowing units in capitals to perpetually remain in supply regardless of if they have any realistic supply route. They're not cut off, and they appear to be a tough target. And here in the Caucasus, you can see the Russians are bringing in some reserves. Are those Romanians? To their front lines, apparently pulling troops from the Romanian front, which I guess that's a really good thing because they're pulling troops away from a more important front line. The Ottomans have already accomplished way more than they did historically, so if the Russians start pulling troops directly from that front and it undermines one of their flanks and hopefully allows us to cut off and destroy Romania, well, all the better for it. Meanwhile, the Russians appeared to be returning to the offensive on the Eastern Front, launching that attack there and launching some attacks further up the line. Romanians in their capital are also launching some offensives. So we've got quite a show going on right now here as the war progresses deeper and deeper into deeper and deeper into this madness. Meanwhile, the Palestinian state has risen up here in the south, but thus far they haven't really advanced at all, so while they exist there, thus far they're more of a nuisance than anything. Here, as you can see, the French are launching some heavy attacks, attempting to liberate some of their troops who are cut off, but nothing successful there, so that'll be good for us next turn, hopefully, here as we end this turn and move into the next. So, on the French front, we've got that French unit cut off. We're going to hit them with some artillery first, and that heavy artillery is much more effective and powerful than regular artillery. You see there that first attack went relatively well here, and then the second attack weakens them pretty darn much, and there we go. Strasbourg is retaken, and another French army destroyed. So hopefully that'll rob some reinforcements from other specialty units, which might have otherwise been purchased with the money that they'll have to replace that unit with. And actually, I'll fall back here and shorten my defensive line. It's a weaker unit on the front there, so I can fall back and get those guys in a better position where only one enemy unit can attack them at a time. So hopefully it allows us to withstand the enemy attacks better. There you see we just finished off a Russian unit, which was cut off and surrounded on the French front line, and So there you go, 2 enemy units destroyed, a Russian and a Franco unit. So far this turn is off to a good start. Let's see, what do we do next? The Italian front, I've got very weakened armies against strong enemy units and air units, but we finish off that armored car unit and another enemy unit destroyed. So, okay, quite a few enemy air units here just behind the front line. Not doing enough damage here when I attack them. But, yeah, so we just destroyed another enemy unit, and now our front line with that advance is in a precarious spot, not where I want to be. Got to get some troops up there to support these guys, though. At least I've got that new unit I can shift down. The Italian front is just full of opportunity, and yet the inability to capitalize on that opportunity because of my own weakness. It's a frustrating situation, to say the least. And, air units, of all things, block my path to Rome. So we'll just kind of reinforce those guys, and we'll take a look elsewhere. So, not enough artillery to bombard the Romanian capital. Probably have to content ourselves with just... yeah, that didn't go well. Just content ourselves with surrounding the city, I suppose. Meanwhile, the Russian front, I don't want to launch headlong attacks into trenches, so really just kind of try and isolate individual units where I think I've got a chance maybe to destroy a unit and gain a temporary objective, rather than any full-scale offensives or anything like that. That was kind of a yawn there. I kind of half yawned. If it picked up on the microphone, I'm sorry about that. I'm recording this at about 2 a.m. But hey, it's like 1 degree out right now where I'm at. So I've been playing a fair amount of games. Actually, I've been able to pry myself away to do this recording here. I've been heavily focused on Scourge of War Waterloo testing lately, so I've had very little gaming time. I played about an hour, hour and a half of Rome Total War, or I guess Attila Total War, and then about a half an hour of this, and that's been all the gaming outside of Scourge of War that I've done the last week. I know 2 hours of gaming is definitely a decent amount, but, you know, and certainly actually is more than I probably play on a given... No, it's definitely more than I play on a given day. With the exception of the last 2 weeks or so, Scourge of War testing, like I said, has really ramped up. I've been playing 3-4 hours a day of that game as part of the test team to try and, you know, test it. And that means I've been playing a lot more games, but they've been very limited. So I've had a few moments here and there to play some other games, and Rome Total War Attila and Commander of the Great War have been the only games that I've spent any time on. And I haven't spent as much time as I probably would have with the amount of free time that I've had the last few days. You can see here I'm trying to shift around the Russian lines here in the Caucasus. If I can get around and surround them, I'll cut off their supply, and that'll make them a lot more susceptible to being destroyed, and making our job a whole heck of a lot easier, hopefully. Meanwhile, in the Palestinian region, I pretty much do nothing yet again. And you can see here the Sinai region. And as you can see there in Palestine, the Arab rebels have taken Mecca, but they have made no attempts to advance beyond it. I've been told by some of the viewers of the channel that that's largely due to their horrible supply situation that they start with in Mecca, and I guess it stays that way for quite some time. I'd like to stamp the revolt out if I can. I don't think I've got sufficient forces, but I'll send at least one unit down there just to see what they can do. Okay. Kind of limited with what else I can do here, so... probably go ahead and end the turn once we do, you know, what reinforcements what we can afford. The Ottomans are always in the trickiest spot as far as reinforcements. It's probably my own fault. I've overbuilt them, so they've got way more units to support than they probably should have. But as as it stands, those extra units have certainly come in handy in the offensive through the Caucasus and now into Ukraine, or the area that is present-day Ukraine. At the time, it was part of the Russian Empire. Dig some troops in, upgrade them. Do my best to kind of consolidate the front lines here, prevent things from moving too much, kind of stabilize things. Got a decent amount of industry points here to use. I don't know if I want to use them on battleships. The British have been kind of non-existent navally for a while, at least. Well, not really non-existent, but at least they've been avoiding challenging us directly. That reminds me, I feel like I've got a submarine somewhere that I should be trying to send into the Atlantic. But yeah, we'll go ahead and I guess I don't know if we can upgrade anything. We got a little bit of money to upgrade some units, so I guess we'll go ahead and do that here where we can. And then we'll get the turn rolling and move into the next one and see what the enemy does to us next. We had a good turn. We destroyed 3 enemy units, an armored car unit of France, was it? An infantry unit of France and a Romanian army unit and a Russian army unit. But yeah, pretty good turn overall. Let's see what we should buy here. With the enemy having so many fighter units to bombard and, kind of pummel us into submission, I figure we might as well buy a fighter unit. They can intercept enemy air units on their way to their targets and hopefully even things up a bit at the front line in terms of the air war. Just a little bit anyway. Also, a little bit of money left over I could use to fix up my Navy, but like I said, the Royal Navy hasn't been doing much. I suppose it's still worth upgrading just to make sure, if we do get in another scrap, that we don't have a 40% strength battleship that is, our Navy's depending on. And at least at this point, it's a good sign. It doesn't look like there's anyone else preparing to come to war with us, as the diplomacy screen doesn't give us any kind of indication that anyone's going to come to war with us. So, yeah, let's go ahead and end the turn and see what happens next.
The AI is thinking. Well, not really thinking, I guess. Analyzing. Deciding moves. Exciting.
Well, the enemy's going to try and flank us. They've attacked 2 units on either end of our line in Italy, which both provide supplies to a stronger unit in front of them. So the enemy's trying to destroy 2 of our units in Italy while cutting off a 3rd. That's not good, but at least it divided the attention of their aircraft, which otherwise have been incredibly destructive to us. And for whatever reason, they just pulled their blimps and their aircraft off the front line, so that's good for us. It might open up a chance at moving on Rome. I guess we'll see. Meanwhile, the Romanians continue attacking near their capital despite being surrounded, and the Russians continue attacking on their front line. I really do hope that the Russian Empire is about to collapse. We're into January of 1917, mid-January of 1917. The Russian army more or less fell apart with a revolution in late February of 1917. So we're getting into that period of time where, if Russia's been humbled enough and lost enough, which I don't know if they've lost enough territory because they still occupy parts of Prussia, but maybe if they've been humbled enough on the battlefield with their casualties, they'll be triggered into the Soviet revolution. They had multiple revolutions. They had a socialist government that came into power, and then those were overthrown by the Lenin and Trotsky, I guess you want to call them, communist power. So there's a lot of craziness that happens. Interestingly enough, though, while the revolution started in February, and the Soviets issued their famous Order Number 1, the first Soviet government issued there, and we just destroyed an artillery unit there, so that should be useful here on the Western Front. Don't know why it was on the front line, but hey, that was a great opportunity to destroy it. But interestingly enough, when the Soviets came to power, it wasn't Lenin, it wasn't Trotsky, it was just a socialist government. And when they first came to power, because they were concerned that there were some views within the army, which had been rebelling against basically horrible conditions and officers that were ordering
offensives and attacks that made no military sense, that were costing huge amounts of lives. The soldiers basically refused to follow orders, not that unsimilarly to what the French did in the Naval offensive. As you can see here, I'm looking at these two units that are in pretty bad shape. On the positive side, if you see here, we have the opportunity to cut off Florence and that British unit there. So we could do that, shorten our lines, and mitigate the threat for the enemy cutting us off and destroying those two units. So I think that's what we'll do. Yeah. Anyway, so interestingly enough, the Naval offensive, which also happened in 1917, was when the French army broke down and mutinied. Difference, the French kind of listened to their soldiers and stopped kind of telling them to do crazy things. The Soviet government responded once they took power by issuing a order called Order Number 1, or Soviet Order, War Order Number 1, or something to that effect, which basically told the soldiers, and this was their way of appeasing the soldiers who they were worried were going to possibly stop fighting altogether. It basically ordered in the follow of the February beginning of the revolution, and the Tsar would abdicate in March, but basically said, listen, well, I don't know if I fully understand it, but essentially my understanding of the way it worked was the order went out and said, please obey your officers unless they tell you to do something crazy stupid. And if they tell you to do something crazy stupid that doesn't coincide with what the new Soviet government in Petrograd, which is where the rebellion started, if they tell you to do something that doesn't match what the revolutionaries in Petrograd are telling you to do, you don't have to listen to it. And make sure officers have no weapons under no circumstances. Even if they tell you they want weapons, make sure they have no weapons. And the weapons and orders and essentially will all go through some kind of committee that's going to be elected by the soldiers in accordance with the Petrograd government, which is where the revolution started in Petrograd. Which is absolutely insane, if you think about it. The idea of, let's make sure that our officers don't have any way to enforce their orders, but you're still supposed to listen to them, unless you don't like what they're saying, and then you don't have to listen to them? I mean, that was just kind of, it was asking for trouble, and it created trouble. Regardless of whether my interpretation of the rule or the law or whatever is totally accurate, what is accurate is the Russian army totally broke down. It stopped functioning as an effective fighting force. The Germans, on their side, decided to play it safe. They basically followed I think it was Napoleon who said, never interrupt your enemy when they're making a mistake. And the Germans kind of took that to heart. They essentially just kind of stood back, stopped launching offensives, didn't really press the matter on the Eastern Front, and just sort of let things go. Let the Soviets and Russians and whatever do their thing. Which is interesting because if they had attacked, it's hard to say. There certainly is the risk that maybe the soldiers would have, come together in a joint defense and agreed to essentially put aside their differences for the defense of Russia. That's possible. It may seem unlikely in hindsight, but it's possible. It's more or less what the French soldiers who mutinied after the Naval offensive agreed to do. They basically said, we're not going to launch any attacks. We're not going to launch any offensives against the Germans because you guys keep getting us killed and do stupid things. But we will make sure that we're going to defend France because we do love France. We're not traitors against France. We just disagree with these stupid orders, which is kind of hilarious if you're considering military discipline. But at the same time, it worked. The Germans, I don't think, recognized the seriousness of the situation either, and they weren't really in a position to launch massive offensives against the French at that time. But nonetheless, it worked, and all of those oh my, holy crap, they just wiped out a whole unit with like 7 air attacks and an offensive. Oh god, Italy is turning messy real quick. The opportunity in Italy seems to be vanishing quickly. But as I was saying, the French were able to kind of operate that way. So if the Germans had launched an offensive against the Russians in the midst of this military breakdown, it is possible. It's not crazy to say that maybe that would have brought the soldiers back together. They would have agreed to put aside their differences temporarily and defend the Soviet or Russian or whatever government. But it seems unlikely, given the fact that later in the war, when the Germans did launch an offensive and the army was in chaos, it more or less just stopped fighting. So, anyway, the point of this whole little spiel is that the Germans had an opportunity as early as March, when all of this stuff went through and started breaking down in 1917. The Germans had an opportunity to perhaps end the war early, but they basically sat back and did nothing. Really nothing until July, when the Russian government, under pressure from the French because of the Naval mutiny, agreed to launch an offensive. Brusilov, who was in command of the Russian forces, picked out his most reliable troops, those being primarily Poles and Swedes and other nationalities not directly affected by the mutiny, and launched an offensive, and actually saw some success. He gained over 30 miles of ground. Once again, Brusilov launched a successful attack against the Allied armies, and ended up pushing them back quite a ways, about 30 miles, which, remember, World War I, 30 miles is a pretty big accomplishment. However, after those initial successes, the army quickly broke down, discipline broke down, soldiers became disencouraged because of the casualties that they were losing. Even though you're gaining ground and having success, casualties are still very high, and the offensive essentially broke down. And then, army morale essentially broke down. The provisional Soviet, more liberal socialist government remained in power until December, when the Germans launched a operation called the Riga Operation, I believe it was called, which was an offensive designed to capture the city of Riga, which was an important city in Russia. And it was the first time that the Germans used their Hunier tactics in battle, and it met with dramatic success. They broke through the Russian lines. They took Riga. The Russian front essentially collapsed, and as a result, the sitting liberal government lost control and was forced from power, and Lenin and Trotsky, who had been recalled back to Russia by this point and had been allowed, I believe, by Germany from Switzerland through Germany into Russia by rail. So the Germans were kind of complicit in the Soviet Revolution. Obviously, understandably, they were fighting the Soviets, perhaps not understanding the consequence of their actions, who knows. But anyway, the Lenin and Trotsky regime came into power and immediately asked for an armistice in early December of 1917. Again, it would be interesting to see what would have happened had the Germans launched the offensive earlier. They could have. They basically rested their forces for that entire time and left about 2 million soldiers on the Eastern Front throughout the entire month or entire year of 1917. If that battle had been fought sooner, after the breakdown of the July offensive, and they had launched an immediate counterpush, even if they had waited from March, if they had launched that immediate counterpush after, the December, the July offensive, if they had ended it, maybe they break through the lines and end the war in September instead of December, and then they get to launch their offensive against the French, 4 or 5 months earlier in 1915, maybe late 1917. Then the U.S. isn't yet in Europe in massive numbers, and who knows what happens. It's hard to say. I don't subscribe to the notion that the U.S. in of itself ended World War I. A lot of people seem to say, oh yeah, the American, GIs, they arrived just in time to stop the German drives on Paris. And sure, there's some truth to that, but it's not like the American units that were deployed there were literally the only units that could have been deployed there. The French and the British, they were low on men, and the 1918 offensives probably wouldn't have been possible without the massive infusion of American manpower that they launched later in the year. But at least not the scale, the scope, and the length of the offensives. They probably would have had to have longer breaks between them. But still, it's an interesting proposition. You know, if Germany does launch that offensive when there are no American reserves, maybe the French and British aren't in as strong a material position in late 1917 or even the fall of 1917. It'd be interesting to see what might have happened. You know, the home front certainly wouldn't have been as bad off. You would have been a year further advanced. The morale may not have been as bad. Casualties may not have been as high. The Allies may not have been able to launch their counteroffensives as quickly, and the Germans may have had more time themselves to respond and to you know, solicit and reinforce their lines. So a lot of what ifs there, but I do think it's an interesting discussion to be had. You know, what if the Germans had launched their offensive against the Russians during the height of their despair, or even March? You know, if they launched that offensive in March, as soon as the Russian army starts to break down with Soviet War Order Number 1, you know, again, it's possible the Soviets come together and agree to bury their differences in defense of the motherland. But given what happened in late 1917, I find that unlikely. Especially considering most of the troops who ended up basically refusing to fight after the Riga operation had nothing to do with the Russian offensive in July, so it's not like those offensives there had anything to do with making them more disillusioned. So, yeah, it's an interesting discussion, one I don't know enough about and wish I knew more about, but there you can see the Italians hammering my troops again and allowing the British there in Florence to break out. So we destroyed about half their unit, but now we're so the situation is growing more and more bleak by the day. Meanwhile, at least on the Ottoman front, we just destroyed 2 entire Russian units and are now driving on Moscow from the south. Hopefully the Russians will decide they need to pull more troops from the front. Yeah, so that's where we're at here. We're now into mid-February 1917, so I guess we'll see soon if the Soviet army breaks down, or I guess they're the Russians right now. If the Russian army breaks down, and if we can force an armistice on them, that would certainly be nice. I don't know how the politics work. They're really, you know, you capture a capital city and you take away their production bonuses, but there really hasn't been any example of a country leaving a war without being totally conquered. So I don't honestly know if the game has that mechanic in it. I sure hope it does, because it needs to in order to be, you know, an accurate representation of what happened and the challenges that a commander or, you know, the Central Powers would face. So I certainly hope that it has that feature built in. But I guess we'll find out here before too long. You can see I just lost that submarine more or less destroyed, and the British Navy moved through the channel. Yeah. So, okay, so the French continue to bring random forces forward on the front line in the Western Front. We continue inflicting some casualties on them, so that's a nice thing to be able to do, I suppose. Meanwhile, the front in Italy is tenuous. We've got tons of units. They're all under strength. And, oh, Rome is totally undefended. The Italian capital is totally undefended. Can I get there with anyone? Is there anyone that can get there? That doesn't look like it. Pull these guys off the front. If only I had full strength units, I could counter some of these really understrength enemy units. Instead, I've got to waste industrial points just recouping the losses from those massive air attacks. Ooh, that was a nice attack there. Kind of took a gamble there and attacked that British unit, and 2-0 in terms of casualties, so that's a nice successful attack there. Hopefully they don't focus their air assaults against me. But yeah, so many troops, so many understrength troops. But Rome is in our sights here. Hopefully the enemy doesn't plop down a unit there next turn. Yeah, the heart of Italy, or a big chunk of Italy, is already in our grasp. So there's that. Meanwhile, the Russian front, mid-February, actually no, early March now. Come on, revolt, you guys. Stop fighting me and surrender and run away, please. Well, those guys got driven back pretty handily. I mean, they've been losing heavy casualties. They just still occupy half of eastern Prussia. The front is way further west, and maybe that's why we haven't beaten them yet. I don't know. You can see here we're advancing on Kursk now, so we're still a ways from Moscow. I think we're like 3 or 4 strategic cities from Moscow, so we're making progress. We'll get there eventually. Driving from the south. leaving one unit in Depernamanisk to guard our flank there. If the enemy does decide to deploy forces against us and cut us off, they should at least be able to buy some time, slow the enemy down, so hopefully we can pull out by rail. You can see here Kursk, Orel, and one more city a little bit further north are all, and that's not really on the center rail track, are all that stands between the Ottomans and taking Moscow. I would have to imagine that the Soviets, I keep calling them Soviets, they're not Soviets, the Tsarists. I have to imagine that the Tsarists are going to deploy some troops to, prevent us from doing that. But I guess we'll see. Okay. So the situation in Italy, is that a capital down there in Palermo? It's got a square. I don't know if that means it's like a capital that isn't being utilized. Nope, it's a fortress. Okay, that's what a square means, is a fortress city. So, good. So Italy is not out of the war, but heck, are there even any Italian forces left? You see three French units there in the on the Italian front, and then you've got one British and one Portuguese. Do the French still even have an army? They might have already been destroyed and their manpower sapped. I'm not sure, but yeah, I have to imagine their national will is very, very low because all the units that they've been destroyed. Now, unfortunately, here it doesn't look like there's any provision for defeating minor allies, and I understand if you're not going to give the player a big perk for defeating Romania. But I feel like the Central Powers should certainly get a bonus if they defeat Italy. Italy is, they're not France and Britain or Russia. They're not one of the superpowers of Europe in this time, but they're certainly strong. Their navy was stronger than the Austro-Hungarian navy, and their army was more than capable of keeping the Austro-Hungarians by themselves bottled up if the Austrians were a little bit distracted. The Italians lost over 250,000 men. They deployed hundreds of thousands of soldiers to the war. Defeating them would have been no small feat for the Central Powers. They weren't able to do it like they were able to do Romania, so come on, guys, why not? Give us a bonus. Give us a victory condition or something for defeating them. What's the point of even going after them then, right? Anyway, so we're going to launch our offensive, start our offensive here against Bucharest. You can see we actually met with some pretty big success there, destroying 7 units. We did lose some casualties, but nothing dramatic, actually, only 1 or 2 per unit. So I'd have to call that little offensive there against Bucharest pretty successful. It remains to be seen how many reinforcements the enemy might be able to bring against us or, repair their units. Again, I'm not quite sure. I suppose I could look at the management screen to see what the manpower statistics are for the other countries, but that seems a little bit gamey. I might have already looked at it, but I didn't retain it. So seems a little bit gamey to me if I was going to go ahead and do that. So I'd prefer to try and avoid that. Meanwhile, maybe I could shift some troops. If I could win on the Russian front, I could shift some troops to crush the Italian front, open up a second front in France. Whoa, whoa, whoa. What is going on? The Royal Navy's battle fleet is deploying to the northern part of our home territory, right in our backyard, so we'll have a big advantage in terms of, good God! What is that, 7, 6? No, 2, 4, 6 enemy air units. And then a ground unit there just drove back our infantry in Italy. Now the Russians launch an attack near Kursk. Rail unit Romanians. So Romania is coming to the rescue of the Russian Empire, it appears, as they deployed a Romanian army there previously. They've now pulled a second Romanian army out. So Romania has lost 1 army, probably about to lose a second in their capital, and now deploying a 3rd army to the Russian front to stop the Ottomans. So there you have it. The Romanians are going to sacrifice their own territory in Romania for the hinterland of Russia. Somehow I doubt that would ever happen, but hey, it makes the situation on the Eastern Front for us a little bit easier, right? You can see they're pulling troops north, the Romanians. More rail units be moving. More troops pulling back, hopefully. No. God, I would love to liberate Königsberg, which is a massive industrial center for Germany. 12 industrial points there. I really hope the game has some kind of provision for Brest-Litovsk, which was the treaty which ended the war between Russia and the Central Powers and was very favorable to the Central Powers. They basically got all of Ukraine, the Baltic states, and Belarusia, but which didn't exist yet by this time. But not a whole lot of present-day Russia. I think they got as far as Rostov, so like right where the Caucasus starts. Now, obviously, this treaty would probably be more favorable to the Ottomans as well because they've taken the entire Caucasus. But again, the game doesn't really have a diplomatic method or diplomatic resolution to conflicts, it doesn't seem. We have taken Italy. Rome has been captured. The Italians can no longer produce units, but doesn't say anything about them leaving the war. Granted, it'd kind of be hard to kick out that massive allied army here. Oh, these units. I think part of the problem with these air units that are just obliterating us is they're heavily, you know, our one troop along this line that keeps getting attacked is not dug in at all because we haven't had time to, because we keep getting slowly driven back. So that supply line to Rome is pretty precarious, so we'll pull that one unit back there to kind of give us a little bit more of a breathing room there. You can see the Portuguese have 2 full armies here on the front. I have to imagine those are the only armies the Portuguese can raise. They don't have a ton of manpower. It's a small country. So I have to think if I destroy those, Portugal will be de facto out of the war as well, just like Italy is kind of de facto out of the war now. I could really use pulling a troop or two from the Western Front. Maybe I'll bring that army unit resting behind Strasbourg out. They're kind of my only reserve on the Western Front, but I could bring them into Italy to hopefully at least stem the tide. Meanwhile, we've got a massive naval incursion by the Allies against us here in Germany, against our home ports. So we'll pull these ships back into port because they'll be harder to attack. Although having a battleship strength of only 3 is probably going to be pretty impossible to win. We could move a cruiser in here to try and defend them a bit. That would be more or less sacrificing that cruiser. The British have 2 battleships. I thought I destroyed most of their battleships, but maybe they built more, or they might have had 4 or 5, and I've already destroyed 2 of them, but they might have had more than I thought. Meanwhile, our subs really aren't able to go any further out, just kind of in the channel here. Probably too heavily beat up. I can't get my other battleship, which is in very good shape, out here to try and counter the British battleships. And block off an attack on Wilhelmshaven, where my battleship is pretty badly damaged. The reason that's important is if they sink that battleship of mine, I'm going to lose 30 national will. That'll drop me from a very healthy 124% under 100%. So I need to do something to try and guard that. So you can see here, even though we're under strength, we do have an advantage in terms of a 1-to-1 combat with a more powerful British cruiser unit. Because we're in our home waters, you get a perk there. So you see there we inflicted 5 losses on them for 3 losses on us. That unit will certainly be destroyed next turn, but we have destroyed a French cruiser and took out half of a British cruiser unit. And, well, that's kind of where we are here in mid-March with the Soviet Revolution seems to show no sign of occurring. The Russians are still holding their own, although not attacking as aggressively as they were early in the war, at least. Meanwhile, the Italian front is messy, but hopefully we can reinforce some of these units here. Rome has fallen, but I don't really think I can drive further into Italy. And maybe we can take Bucharest and knock Rome. See, the problem with Romania is just like Serbia, they have 2 capitals. They've got another one in Tasti or whatever. So we just took Bucharest and destroyed another Romanian unit. Meanwhile, we're driving a little bit further into Romania now on the southern part of the front. These troops all freed up should be able to really help knock Romania out of the war and really outflank the Russian line. If we can knock Romania out of the war, we can swing around and threaten the entire Russian front. And I don't know if they've got the manpower. If they're pulling Romanian troops away to defend Kursk, I can't imagine they've got a whole lot of troops in reserve ready to deal with us on the other end. So that's good. Yeah, we're coming up to the end of this video. This has been a little bit longer. What are we approaching? About 40 minutes now. But once this turns over, I'd say we'll probably go ahead and end this video here. Oh, apparently I can reinforce some of these guys now. So we'll reinforce that frontline unit. But yeah, if the Russians are pulling Romanian troops out to deal with the attacks on the heartland of Russia, and they're basically opening up the southern part of their line to being flanked, that's good for us. It means we can basically isolate and destroy individual Russian units, just work our way up the line and destroy them. Too bad it seems by the time anything like that happens, it'll be almost the end of 1918. Now, the plus side of that is we haven't done anything to antagonize the United States. They don't appear ready for war against us. So at least in that sense, you know, the war with the U.S., we won't have to worry about their massive manpower coming over here and aiding the enemy. You can see here we're still launching offensives against the Russians, and they're still giving a pretty good fight, so it doesn't appear to be about to surrender or retreat or anything. And again, it makes some sense. They do occupy a good portion of eastern Prussia, as I've already mentioned. But they've certainly lost heavy casualties, especially as of late. You know, early in the war, they were really punishing us in terms of casualties, but now they haven't been able to do much in the way of inflict casualties on us. Unfortunately, our fighter unit still isn't ready. And, yeah, so that's the situation here. We're going to hopefully cut off Constantinia of that Romanian port and kind of work our way up that front and ideally collapse the entire Russian line here, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. Russian front, Romanian front looking better, Italian front looking very precarious, West front looking stagnant, and some progress on the Ottoman front, but again, too under strength to really rush to Moscow. So that's the situation. Rome has fallen, and who knows what's next. Thank you for watching, guys. This has been the Historical Gamer on episode 21 now of the Commander Great War Let's Play. I appreciate you tuning in. I appreciate the support you've shown the series over its pretty long length that it's been running. And until next time, guys, I'm out.